Steam curled from the farmhouse percolator and drifted across the yard like a flag of truce. A cast-iron skillet snapped and hissed, each pop sharp as small arms fire in the cold. 2 army trucks rattled to a halt by the frost-silvered wheat, tailgates clanging as military police shouted, "Detail, off!" 15-year-old Friedrich Bauer climbed down, boots slipping on the frozen mud. He had learned to keep his chin up in the Hitler-Jugend fire brigade, to look taller than he was, but the smell ambushed him. Bacon. Real bacon, thick-cut, riding warm over the bright sting of coffee. The boys went still. One stomach growled, loud, comic, mortifying, and their laughter died as fast as it started because the hunger felt like surrender. Private First Class Cal Mac McKendry, corn-fed Iowan with an M1 and a dog-eared Geneva booklet in his breast pocket, watched hands, eyes, shoes. He knew the kitchen schedule by heart, pancakes, eggs, bacon, white bread by the stack. He also knew why. Article 11. Prisoners ate rations equal to base camp troops. It wasn't kindness, it was order. Inside, Evelyn Hart, apron flowered, sleeves rolled, tipped grease into a labelled tin, the scent of it running ahead of her like a memory of another piece. The county agent had sent her POW labour to save the harvest. She would feed them like hired hands because that was the deal and because the wheat would not wait. A neighbour at the fence muttered, "Feeding the enemy?" Evelyn kept plating, said, "Feeding them like Americans, the way you say the simplest, hardest thing." Fritz rubbed a sleeve against his nose to hide the sniff. He hadn't smelled pork fat since 1943, not like this, not without the ash taste of fear. He told himself this was a trick, Americans soft with plenty, easy to break. Then the MP's voice cut the air. "Fall in for detail." The boys straightened as if the smell itself were a sergeant. Mac checked the line. Boots clean, hands visible, no sudden moves. Coffee steam lifted through sunlight like the day's first hymn. Somewhere a dog barked once and decided these strangers were already part of the morning. The skillet popped again and every head turned. The gate opened. The day began. Dust powdered the crucifix at the crossroads as columns of prisoners wound past, shirt tails knotted to rifle barrels, flags made in a hurry from the white parts of fear. 10 days earlier, before bacon was a rumour, the road out of the Ruhr had been a lesson in arithmetic. The US 1st and 9th Armies were closing jaws of steel around an industrial heartland, and boys like Fritz, pulled from classrooms and fire brigades, were handed single-shot Panzerfäuste and words like final victory to brace their hands. The weapon could bite hard at 60 metres and punch through 200 millimetres of armour, but it could not reload faith. When the tanks kept coming and the artillery rolled its steady drumbeat, you realised a throwaway tube was a promise only for 1 second of one street. The Carabiner 98K kicked dutifully, 5 rounds at a time, but ammunition came like permission slips, and permission kept getting lost. A Gebirgsjäger sergeant, boots cracked from mountain duty, now walking factory valleys, told them to keep their chins up, to aim at tracks, to wait for the slit of a hatch. He had seen hunger turn boys fierce, he had not seen hunger load supply trains. Surrender came in murmurs, 1 village, then 3, then a river of men. The figures would have stunned anyone still reading the front page. Roughly 317,000 prisoners taken in the Ruhr pocket between April 1st and 18th, plus 24 generals whose staffs had finally run out of maps to argue over. Processing cages sprouted from fields like scarecrows, wire strung fast, water cans lined in rows. Chalk marks counted heads. The trucks that had brought ammunition now hauled captives to railheads, the army's handwriting precise, even when the paper was mud. Fritz remembered the first time someone said stateside, like a rumour of another planet. He pictured barns and wide roads, meat on plates. He pictured beatings. The boxcar door slid and clanged. Darkness took the arguments out of their voices. The train pulled. Far away, in a country he had been taught to hate, a woman he would never forget was already pouring bacon grease into a tin against tomorrow. Lieutenant Warren Rail McKee traced a fingertip down the chalkboard until it squeaked. Ship to port. Port to reefer. Reefer to rail siding. Siding to depot bakery. Bakery to mess. He boxed the last word twice. Skillet. Behind him, the night yard breathed frost and locomotive smoke. A refrigerated car hissed like a patient animal, while a switchman's lantern winked in and out of the steam. The Quartermaster Corps did not win headlines, but it won mornings. The order on McKee's desk was plain as doctrine. Prisoners of war would eat rations equal to troops at base camps. Bread, meat, coffee, fat, because discipline without parity bred trouble faster than yeast. He turned to numbers that would have sounded impossible to a boy holding a Panzerfaust. 2,710 Liberty ships built between 1941 and 1945. Steel hulls turned into floating guarantees that bacon could cross oceans. One record launch had gone from keel to sea in 4 days and 15 hours. Speed so audacious, the stopwatch became a weapon. At the depot, ovens rolled white loaves in ranks. Field bakeries measured output in loaves per hour and gallons of coffee per urn. Motor pools of 2.5-ton GMC CCKWs prowled like beetles, hauling sacks and cans, each truck its own promise that the last mile would not defeat a plan. In the mess, a sergeant with a ladle the size of a small shovel rehearsed tomorrow's choreography. Stand to, count off, trays forward, no wasted motion. None of it was sentimental. Food moved on timetables and grease pencil, through reefer temperature charts and switch lists into pans that snapped just before dawn. McKee wiped the board clean and drew it again until the arrows flowed as one line. Ship arrow skillet. He underlined the middle with a quick, hard stroke, the way a rifleman checks a chamber by touch. When he capped the chalk, his watch read 0230. In 3 hours, an MP would open a gate half a continent away, and a smell would do more than any speech to finish breaking an enemy's faith. That, he thought, was the whole point of engineering. Make mercy inevitable. The kitchen windows sweated from the contrast of stove heat and April cold, each pane a soft-edged mirror where boys could see their smallness and pretend otherwise. Evelyn's fork scraped a cast-iron lip. The grease slid to its tin with a sound every farm child recognized as wealth in winter. Ration stamps had taught her the price of flavour, but the county agent's form was clear. POW labour in the fields meant breakfast in the kitchen, accounted for, logged and served with the dignity that kept hands coming back. She moved like a squad leader, all economy, pancakes stacked, eggs turned, bacon laid, plates advanced. Fritz stood by the door, cap wrung in his fists, language battering his throat. An MP touched his elbow, said, "Go on," the way you'd steady a skittish colt. He sat. Maple syrup, he learned the word quickly, ran in amber lines that looked like something a jeweller would cut. Coffee hit his nose like a memory from before the air raids. It was impossible that enemies ate with such certainty. Evelyn counted strips as carefully as ledger entries, then put one more on Fritz's plate because sometimes a mother's math outruns policy. The county agent arrived with chit packets. He explained, slow and loud, that pay would be script credited, deductions for quarters and mess, hours tracked to the minute. The boys nodded because nodding is a language. They would have worked anywhere for this smell. The impossible statistic here was not a number, but a ritual. Troop equivalent calories exceeding 3,600 per day, measured into enemies as if they were kin. Fritz chewed and realized propaganda had stolen his childhood palate. He had been taught that the decadent starved, that the righteous fed on virtue. Now virtue tasted like pork fat and white bread, and the righteous cooked for strangers before dawn. He would later say the room felt like church, steam rising, hands folded, a hush every time the skillet spoke. When the MP called time, trays clattered back to the rack. Fritz wiped his plate so clean you could see your face in it, then followed the line out into wind sharp enough to make eyes water. Behind him, the grease tin cooled, saving the day for a biscuit yet unborn. Mac's day ran on checks and countersigns. He touched the butt of his M1 Garand as he passed the rack, habit more than worry, then patted the breast pocket where the Geneva booklet lived, its corners softened by sweat. Article 11 might as well have been stamped on the guardhouse door. Prisoners ate as soldiers ate. It wasn't softness, it was armour against chaos. He inspected boots for laces and soles, hands for nervous twitches, eyes for that wide hunger that could turn a mess line into a stampede if you let schedules slip. Parity is protection, he told the new kid from Brooklyn, explaining sight lines between the towers, arcs of fire they prayed to keep theoretical, the way rifles were stacked muzzle down in the mess as a sermon about safety you could hear in the clink of steel. The rifle itself was poetry by numbers. .30-06 Springfield, semi-automatic, 8 rounds on an N-block clip, 5.4 million produced, so a farm boy could become an arm of policy. Scarcity made people reckless. Abundance, properly ruled, made them predictable. The chaplain came by with a pocket service schedule and a memory for names that humbled everyone. He said full bellies calmed devils, and nobody argued theology with a man who'd written to mothers and wives from 3 continents. In the infirmary, a medic logged temperatures and ration adjustments with the same gravity he would have given a combat wound. You fed enemies like troops because you wanted their hands steady around saw blades and scythes, not around stolen knives. The bulletin board posted the afternoon's classes, English phrases, mechanics, a lecture on safe harvest. Mac pinned the schedule high where even pride could reach it. Outside, wind combed the wire, making a sound like a hymn played on teeth. He walked the fence, boots grinding cinders, and thought about the day he'd first read the rule book in North Africa, how order had kept boys alive when nothing else agreed to. The mess door opened and the smell rolled out again. "Time to move," he said, and the line moved, not because he shouted, but because the plan held. Lights out hummed in the barracks like a distant transformer. The single bulb swayed, throwing barbed shadows across bunks built for men who dreamed toward home in every language. Fritz lay on his back and counted roof knots, a trick learned in shelters when counting seconds between explosions. The older sergeant, a Gebirgsjäger whose boots showed a mountain's worth of miles, whispered the catechism of scarcity. Turnip fat, black bread, chicory brew, the weeks when meat existed only in stories. He reminded them of the rule about saving crusts in a pocket kerchief. He warned them not to believe the first warm hand. Kindness, he said, was a weapon. He palmed a sugar cube when he thought no one watched. Someone did. Belief cracked where sweetness touched the tongue. The translator corporal at the end of the aisle would have noted quietly how hunger's edge dulled under a schedule. He would have marked morale as stabilizing, a word with the weight of a safe morning. The impossible statistic arrived as a rumour and then a revelation. 5.4 million M1 Garans produced so that a citizen army could hand a rifle to a kid and make him the equal of a doctrine. Numbers like that didn't explain why a kitchen gave a boy an extra strip of bacon, but they framed the miracle. A nation so flush with steel and bread it could afford to treat enemies as future neighbours without blinking. Fritz turned the word bacon over in his mouth, practising the B soft as a prayer. He thought of the Panzerfaust, a single shot, a shout, a hope that armour would bloom into fire, and understood how thin one-and-done bravery felt next to the American way of repeating a good idea until it became a landscape. He did not stop being German. He did start dreaming of engines he could fix, of rails that led to a job, of a morning where a smell told him more truth than any poster. The bulb flickered. The bunks creaked in answer. Sleep came like surrender, and no one had to force it. At first light the field shimmered as wind ran its hand across the heads of grain, and a line of POWs stepped from the deuce and a half into a world so orderly it felt like a kindly ambush. Evelyn's voice cut through the gusts, assigning rows and tools, explaining with gestures what words would learn later. Safety first. No hands near belts, no games with PTO shafts, eyes on the foreman's flag. The county agent checked his ledger, pencil smoothed by the callous of doing this every day. The tractors coughed, then settled into the contented thrum of machines fed on time. Fritz shouldered a sack and followed a rhythm older than doctrine. Stoop, lift, carry, breathe. The day's arithmetic unfolded in simple operations. More bodies in fields meant more acres cut before weather turned fickle. More bushels into boxcars meant more flour to depots feeding armies crossing rivers you only knew from maps. The mess line would make noon sensible, bread thick enough to make your jaw work, stew that forgave a morning of labour, coffee tasting like earned mercy. Impossible to him, but perfectly plain to a county clerk, was how bacon in became bushels out. Calories weren't charity, they were investments paid back by dusk. The bulletin from the railhead named quotas like battle objectives. A single farm day could push a train's departure forward by an afternoon, and a train moved the schedule of a division like a chess piece 2 squares ahead of fear. He learned tool names in English the way he had learned rifle parts in German, and one vocabulary felt heavier with hope. When the wind died, birdsong returned like a file note at the bottom of a page. Status: improving. The agent tallied the afternoon into neat columns and smiled at the obvious. Manpower once aimed at destruction made better sense in wheat. The boys climbed back onto the truck cleaner than Labour had any right to leave them, faces tired, eyes sharper from the dignity of competence. The gate came into view just as the kitchen's exhaust sent up the night signal. Grease, bread, coffee, a promise kept. Night made the yard a constellation of work. Lanterns swung like slow stars between strings of cars, while steam folded and refolded around couplers that kissed with metallic ceremony. McKee's pencil snapped when the reefer didn't appear on time, but a snapped pencil is just the starting gun for a certain class of American. The dispatcher triangulated by telephone and instinct, a brakeman jogged his miles into the dark, and a switch engine muttered assent. Reefer located, new crew assigned, clearances stacked, siding freed. The convoy plan unrolled like a map you trust. If the cold chain held through the last hour, dawn would taste like a plan kept. The reefer's thermometer read what the manual wanted, and the seals glinted like tiny medals. In the motor pool, GMC CCKWs dozed until the sergeant thumped a fender. They woke, snorting gasoline promises, carburetors clearing their throats. He'd memorized fuel allocation charts as if they were hymns. The mess sergeant rehearsed the choreography again, sleeves rolled, ladle shining. Ovens, field and depot, counted their labour in loaves per hour, coffee urns in gallons, numbers that might make poetry if you'd seen a boy put his nose over a cup and nearly cry. The impossible fact for any enemy to swallow wasn't a single number, but the sequence. A ship built in 4 days and 15 hours. Meat that rode frost across a continent. Trucks that bridged a gap the timetable had no right to close. A skillet that said good morning to people yesterday called POWs. One reefer late could have meant 1,000 disappointed trays. Instead, the yard hummed, the convoy moved, and dawn smelled right on schedule. McKee waited at the edge of the yard until he heard the distinct homey sizzle from the mess line 2 blocks away. That sound confirmed the doctrine better than signatures. Ship, skillet, validated by grease. He allowed himself one grin in the dark, then went back to the board to make the next miracle look inevitable. The chalkboard in the camp HQ took updates like surf takes stones, daily, patient, remorseless. Arrivals today, the line read, and the numbers turned like an odometer. The Ruhr pocket had closed, the report said. Approximately 317,000 prisoners between April 1st and 18th, plus staff officers who had finally folded their maps and their pride. More were inbound. Scaling a camp was not drama, it was carpentry and arithmetic. Extra cots erected by squads that could frame a barracks as neatly as a Sunday school porch. Mess seating expanded in rotations you could set your watch by. Latrines added, water points doubled, infirmary cots lined with sheets that smelled of bleach and civilization. The impossible statistic for a boy who'd learned war as scarcity was right there on a grease board. Tens of thousands processed without riot or famine, every tray a vote of confidence in a democracy's obsession with schedules. Mac briefed his guards. "Same rules," he said. "Rules are how we make more of ourselves than there are of us." Parity didn't bend just because the head count did. The kitchen adjusted order sheets and took delivery without flinching. Loaves stacked like white bricks. Pork counted, logged, thawed. Coffee brewed in urns that could outgallons a village well. Fritz wrote a letter home on the paper they issued, lines careful as a recruit's first parade. "We are treated by rules," he wrote, underlining the sentence twice, the way a man might underline his own name after a victory he cannot explain. The county agent's ledger forecast the harvest hitting quota early. The railhead telegraphed an earlier departure for a grain train that would make someone else's breakfast possible. A chaplain read the names of battles at evening prayer like a ledger of debts paid. When the sun dropped, the wire sang its thin song, and the kitchen sent up the signal that the day was won. Grease on a cold breeze, meat and bread and coffee, promising that tomorrow would repeat the miracle. Somewhere, a boy fell asleep with the word bacon resting safe on his tongue. Chalk dust turned McKee's knuckles white as he boxed a single word in the centre of the board. Policy. Around it, he drew arrows not unlike a corps commander's scheme of manoeuvre. Port to reefer, reefer to rail, rail to depot, depot to mess, mess to morale, morale to order, order to safety, safety to output. You could call it charity if you liked, he told the room, MPs, county officials, mess chiefs, but charity that ran on timetables, fuel and forms was better named discipline. Article 11 of the 1929 Geneva Convention wasn't a footnote. It was an operations order. Keep prisoners on troop-equivalent rations, bread, meat, coffee, fat, and you brought down risk faster than any fence extension. A figure hung in the air like a challenge coin. The death rate for German POWs in US custody hovered far below 1%, on the order of 0.1%, a number that embarrassed tyrannies that could not keep their own fed. Another figure steadied the sceptical. Approximately 425,000 Axis prisoners on American soil at peak, most of them German, processed, housed and fed without the system blinking. And if anyone doubted the reach, he pointed to the ocean. 2,710 Liberty ships in 4 war years, steel turned into schedule. He did not sell mercy as softness. He sold it as reciprocity, how you wanted your own boys treated if captured, and as math. Full bellies meant fewer desperate acts, fewer guards pulled into fights, fewer broken hands on sores that could not spare them. A county agent added the column that always sealed the argument with farmers. Labour fed well became acreage harvested on time. Acreage met quotas. Quotas filled contracts that fed divisions crossing rivers. Mac watched the nods travel around the room and felt the simple pride of a doctrine that matched the shape of a skillet. The meeting broke. He stepped outside into late light and the smell that proved the theory. Far away, trains made small thunder. The board inside still read policy. He would have underlined it again if he'd had more chalk. The bugle sounded like a boy trying to be a man and almost managing it. Flags climbed halyards, and throats worked around feelings that didn't fit uniform pockets. Some prisoners cheered, some wept, some stared as if the air had changed shape. The mess still served on time. Victory Day did not cancel supper. In the chapel tent, a chaplain read names of towns and rivers and asked for mercy on enemies now counted as neighbours under a fence that felt less necessary by the hour. The education hut filled, English lessons taught by a corporal whose vowels were pure Brooklyn, mechanics lectures where a carburetor's parts became new nouns to carry into a future. Safety talks that sounded like sermons from men who believed in fingers and eyes as much as in souls. In the kitchen, a biscuit recipe made good use of saved grease, and Evelyn's church ladies pinned war bond stickers to a donation jar that read "Wheat into wings." The impossible note this time was quieter but rang longer. A democracy kept troop-equivalent rations for captives even when celebrations tempted shortcuts, and the schedule did not flinch. Repatriation officers began their briefings, dates sketched in pencil because ships and signatures move at human speed. Fritz copied words into a small notebook. Clutch, gasket, torque. He would have sworn he felt the world tilt toward usefulness. Mac wrote 2 letters, one to a mother whose son had not come home from Italy, one to a guard's wife about a new baby, and then walked the fence a last time before lights out. The wire sang its thin metallic hymn, and on the other side a chorus practiced a hymn of their own in German that needed no translation. When taps drifted over the parade ground, steam still floated from the mess exhaust like a promise kept. Tomorrow would be ordinary, which was the most extraordinary thing a war could offer. Years unspooled and rewound until memory was a film with splices you could see. The county museum had a case with a POW armband and a photograph of a branch camp that once borrowed the dawn and gave it back warmer. A skillet sat under glass, its black sheen reflecting the face of a boy who read captions in a whisper. An old mechanic guided him, hands oiled by a lifetime of engines. Friedrich Bauer, now Fritz to everyone, and Grandpa to one. He told the boy that the first free country he ever met was a smell. He said the figures mattered, approximately 317,000 men captured in 18 April days, roughly 425,000 prisoners on American soil at peak, a death rate in custody so low it made tyrants look the way they were. Small, 2,710 Liberty ships that turned ocean into schedule. Field and depot rations, measured at more than 3,600 calories a day, counted into enemies without blinking. He said those were the rails the story ran on. The rest was human. A woman saving grease for biscuits and for a future. A guard who carried a rule book like a medal. A lieutenant who drew a line from ship to skillet and made mercy inevitable with arrows and stubbornness. If the boy asked about the enemy, Fritz answered with respect. They were like him, he said, afraid, hungry, brave in ways that burned fast. They had been handed doctrines like single-shot weapons and told to fire once with faith. America had handed its people repeatable processes and told them to keep going until the world was safe. The impossible statistic that still made him smile was this. At least once, a nation produced not just more guns and ships than its enemies, but more breakfasts than hate could spoil. Outside, wheat shouldered wind into surf, same as ever. The museum air held its quiet. The boy leaned closer to the skillet as if it might speak. It already had. He could almost hear the hiss and smell what his grandfather meant. Victory that sounded like a kitchen and moved on rails you could trust.